Flight 4184 has crashed into a field just outside Roselawn, Indiana. Both pilots, the 2 flight attendants, and all 64 passengers are dead. The Roselawn crash would soon become one of the most important accidents in aviation history. It will lead investigators to new conclusions about a string of older crashes. The morning after the crash of American Eagle Flight 4184, a team from the National Transportation Safety Board is on the scene just outside Roselawn, Indiana. Greg Fife is the lead investigator.
The morning that we arrived at the accident site, it was cold, it was overcast, it was one of those drizzly, dank days. All you could smell was the Jet A or the kerosene fuel, and because it was muddy and wet, you had that odor or that aroma of dirt. And so with all of those smells, that really evokes some emotion there. And now you have to walk through that field and actually start to do your job.
The crash site is soaked in jet fuel and hydraulic fluid. Human remains are scattered everywhere. The site is declared a biohazard.
With 4184 was one of those types of accidents where there was very little left of the airplane.
Investigators know that the way the wreckage is spread out can tell them how the plane hit the ground.
Because there was a fan-shaped debris pattern and it was spread out over a very large area, we knew that the impact was very shallow but at a very high speed.
The airplane's 2 flight recorders are found intact in the tail. They're taken to the NTSB's labs for analysis. The data on the recorders could provide the clues investigators need to solve the mystery. But extracting the data takes time. In the meantime, investigators look for the location of key pieces of wreckage.
The first things we typically look for are the 4 corners of the airplane.
The NTSB's Bob Swain leads that search.
You're looking for the nose and the tail and the 2 wingtips, because if you can tell where the 4 corners of the airplane are, you get an initial idea of whether the pilot was in control or not.
The plane's 4 corners are far from each other. The nose and cockpit are completely destroyed. This tells investigators that the plane hit the ground nose first in a shallow but rapid descent. The fact that the plane wasn't in a steep descent on impact indicates that the pilots had some control in the final seconds before the crash. They just ran out of room to pull up. Investigator Bob Swain, meanwhile, has recovered some of the plane's instruments, including its attitude director indicator, also known as the artificial horizon. It's a key instrument that tells pilots if they're flying level. If it malfunctioned, it could have misled the crew and caused them to make mistakes.
We had a pretty good idea of the attitude of the airplane at impact, so it would really help at that point to see if the pilots had the same view of the flight that we found as they hit the ground. A lot of the cockpit pieces use a fluorescent paint or something similar, and when they contact each other, little bits of the paint transfer. If we look at those with a black light, we can see things that the naked eye cannot see.
There's a good imprint here.
The force of the impact has left tiny scratches on the shattered instrument. Swain discovers that the attitude indicator seems to have been working. Its final readings show the plane was leveling off. The instrument coincides with the plane's actual position on impact.
It indicated that at least the flight instruments that the pilots would have been looking at were appropriate, they were proper, that the pilots had something to fly by.
The discovery means that the pilots knew their plane was diving towards the ground. Investigator Greg Fife is getting a clearer picture of the flight's final seconds. Now he wants to know about the history of this flight before it fell from the sky.
One of the elements of the investigation, of course, was to look at air traffic control.
Eagle 184 holds southeast on.
Fife learns that Flight 4184 had been in a holding pattern southeast of Chicago for 39 minutes before the crash.
When we looked at the air traffic control records, we found that the flow rate, that is the number of airplanes that were going into Chicago O'Hare at the time, had to be reduced because of the weather moving through the area.
I do apologize for all the delays.
One of the aspects that we found was that one of the controllers in the facility was relatively new. They were considered a trainee.
Had an inexperienced controller put Flight 4184 in peril? Chief Investigator Greg Fife wants to know more about the weather conditions along the holding pattern.
I want weather data, pilot reports, its atmospheric conditions, Doppler radar, anything you can find.
Flight 4184 wasn't the only plane circling O'Hare that day. Several other planes were also on hold. They all landed safely. Interviews with the pilots of some of those planes give investigators an important clue.
One after another, they all experienced icing, some as much as 3/4 of an inch.
Many of the pilots report the same thing: ice. Dr. Marsha Politovich works at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. She's one of the leading experts on icing and the danger it poses to aircraft.
It essentially changes the shape of the wing while you're in flight. It creates drag, it reduces lift, it causes performance and handling problems, and it's just not a good thing to have.
Investigators examine weather records from the day of the crash. They find a disturbing pattern of reports of icing all along a cold front near Chicago. But the reports describe the icing as light to moderate. Perhaps the size of the commuter plane was a factor. Large jets generally fly above the dangerous conditions inside a cloud. But the ATR-72 can't do that.
Smaller plane can't fly as high, they're stuck in the icing environment for longer, they may not have de-icing equipment, and if they get in trouble, they may not have enough excess power to get out of it.
Investigators discover that Flight 4184's holding pattern took it through layers of cloud repeatedly. Each time it would have been exposed to icing conditions. Steve Frederick was flying out of Chicago on the morning of the crash. He flew through the same treacherous weather.
Each time that I went through that cold front during that day, the weather was intensifying, the ice was getting worse, and I was getting more and more concerned.
Frederick asked his captains on a warning about the weather, so that other pilots would be alerted to the danger.
I found out a little bit later that my captain had never warned dispatch, and these pilots never got the warning about the ice that was out there that day. And there's no feeling in the world that can compare to how badly I felt at that moment.